So as we were talking last week, and just as a reminder, we are recording now and I'm posting those up on, you can find the link to the Sunday school site there to get to the YouTube page. Last week we talked about theories of atonement. And so this was going back and looking at how the early church viewed how salvation worked. And again, I want to be very clear, they had a clear understanding that salvation was through Christ. But the question was, how did Christ's death, burial, and resurrection actually end up producing salvation? And so that has evolved over time. And oh wow, I'm doing Donna now in like a thermal image thing. That's a cool look. And so the reason I wanted to cover that last week before we got back into picking up some of the history track is that I realized we'd spent so much time, and appropriately so, because all of those church councils primarily they centered around other things and other heresies, but so much of them are around what was the main thing being discussed, like beginning at the Council of Nicaea? The Trinity, right? The concept of the Trinity. Who was Christ? Who was God? Who is the Holy Spirit? That we sort of got lost in the fact that we hadn't covered or talked about what was the church thinking specifically, collectively, and as a whole about the role of Christ in salvation. And why that's really, really important is if we didn't cover it, we were suddenly going to run into the Reformation, and definitely need to talk about it because that's a huge part of what goes on in the Reformation, but without the historical context of it. So we would have had to go back. And so I decided last week was probably a good place to sort of interject that. So we covered, roughly speaking, three, and I'm going to go ahead and do a summary here because I think it's worth doing and making sure everybody's up to speed. We talked about three of the first six of the common theories of atonement or theories of salvation. And we talked about sort of what they were and setting them up for the contrast of what you don't see on this chart. This chart's actually cut off. There's a version of this chart that has all six of them. Is we're going to get to the understanding that we have as modern Protestants, which is the idea of vicarious substitution. That's the label for how we look at salvation, is that Christ was our substitute for a penalty we could not pay to buy salvation that we could not earn. So we have a substitution concept of salvation, which is a later development. It's actually a reformed development. And so I wanted to set up just a little bit about what the church thought before that. We talked about the recapitulation theory, which is that Christ became, and by the way, all of these have basis, as we talked about last week, in what? They have basis in Scripture. You can find the Scriptures to understand where this came from. Is that the recapitulation theory was that Christ was the second Adam, fixing what Adam got wrong, Christ got right. So we talked about that. We talked about what's called the ransom to Satan theory, which still is a prominent theory in Eastern Orthodox concepts of salvation, which was the idea that Christ paid the price with his death to buy us back from the bondage that we had been sold into through sin to Satan. And then we talked about satisfaction theory, which still is at the core of Roman Catholic theology, in the sense that Christ died to purchase merits which are given to us as believers through our belief in him and through the church. So I wanted to set up those three things. We'll definitely hit them again when we come back around to talking about the other things, particularly as we get into the Reformation. But we took a little break from history last week to go down that path. So did anybody who was here last week or who watched the class online have any questions about any of those? All right, clear as mud. So today we're going to go back to history a little bit, picking back up. We are roughly in the time frame of the date that we talked about last week being a relevant date. Anybody remember what happened in 1054?
The schism.
Great schism. What's a schism?
A divide, break.
Right. So what was great and what divided in 1054?
The
Eastern Church,
the Eastern Western Church.
Right. And as we talked about, it was
Over
the actual thing that rose to a head seems relatively minor, but it had been building for a couple of centuries. the thing that caused it, though, the actual thing that caused it over was what kind of bread you were using in communion, and it led to the Pope and the patriarchs of the two respective parts of the churches excommunicating each other, and we talked a little bit about the reason for that. So we're sort of up to that period of time. So when we pick up from history here, we're going to be over the next couple of 100 years. So roughly from about the middle of the 11th century on up to about the 14th/15th century. And we're going to cover sort of three broad things in that. And then we really get to where a lot of things happen in terms of understanding our theological development was we get to the Reformation. Because the Reformation is the other next coming big schism in the church, and it's not over something as minor or inconsequential as the type of bread being used in communion. It's over very important issues.
For some reason, I can't get it to connect to my hearing aid. Connect to my hearing aid.
Over the concept of salvation and theology. We're going to start today, though, by taking another one of those little side journeys that we could have taken at some other point, but I think is sort of important. And that's we're going to look at monasticism, or the concept of, lost it again, keep doing the same thing every week, it feels like. So when I say monastery, what pops into your head?
Monks.
Monks. Who are monks?
Classically, men that have kind of like dedicated themselves to study. They typically, I've heard of monks who like dedicate not being able to speak or not being able to do a specific thing, kind of like they're giving it up so that they can concentrate on it's almost like a fast of something, but may not be a fast of food.
Okay. So you think of them as leading these very aesthetically denying lives. They're denying themselves.
I mean, that's kind of what I think.
Yeah.
Cloistered.
I'm sorry?
Cloistered.
Cloistered, because they're all sort of separated, right? I'm sadly of that generation. Maybe just one of the things that pops into my mind when I think monks is anybody remember the IBM commercials, maybe from the late 70s or early 80s?
Yeah.
Where it was like, it had like the monk who he secretly had the copier because they were in the process of making, doing copies of manuscripts, but didn't want to let on the fact that this is easy now. We've got a copier. We don't have to handwrite these things. So my image of a monk, strangely enough, the first thing I think that pops into my head is some image of a guy who's got the shaved head, maybe the tonsure kind of thing around his head. And or I think of a monk from the IBM commercial. So you may not have that same thing, or maybe you now do. Maybe I've now inflicted that upon you. But this
I think of a Shaolin monk.
I'm sorry?
When you say monk, though, it has to bring up like a Buddhist monk or Shaolin monk as well.
Oh, that's an interesting point. We were actually watching something on TV yesterday that was about it was about more or less about China. But yeah, I forget, Buddhist monks, and you're right, that's a tradition that exists in those religious traditions at the Buddhist temples and things like that. That's a very good point, Albert. It's easy for us to just contextualize that term inside of Christianity and not realize that others have the same thing. So where would somebody get the idea that they need to be a monk?
I think from the Old Testament.
In what way, Mickey?
You had situations where certain men were becoming extremely devout and they couldn't do certain things. You also had that situation where, right after the death and resurrection of Christ, you had a group of people that we now talk about in reference to their writings and what have you, that bring us back to really about the first century or so with their writings. I'm failing to remember their names. I'm sorry.
You think about the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think it's a really good point that Mickey makes, is that you can see examples of those who were called to isolate themselves or take on some special vow in Scripture going back to the Old Testament. For example, do I remember what the Nazarite vow was?
Not to cut your hair.
Not to cut your hair. Not to cut your hair, not to drink anything that was fermented. Who would be a good example of somebody who took a Nazarite vow?
Samson.
Samson, right? And remember, his strength was not because he had long hair, but was because the long hair was symbolic of his Nazarite vow to God. So there is an example in the Old Testament of Samson being an example of a special vow above and beyond what was there. And then we also have examples of prophets at various points who also went off into seclusion. You think of instances where Elijah, for example, was called off to go into the desert, was received revelation there. Think about Moses in the sense of what happened when he was, after he had been exiled from Egypt. He's on the backside of the desert. So there are examples in the Old Testament of special encounters with God, and they happen in what context? Being, for lack of a better term, I'll just go with being alone. And so you can see where that comes as as something that comes from Scripture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So then in the New Testament, can you think of any New Testament examples of what might be along the lines of, almost call it monkish behavior. Let's call it monastic behavior, but monkish behavior, if you will, in the New Testament. Who would be a good example there?
Paul.
John the
Okay.
Baptist.
John the Baptist. Y'all are missing one of the best examples. Jesus.
It's Sunday school, so I had to say Jesus.
It looks like a squirrel, but the answer must be Jesus. Jesus, remember, for 40 days went off into the
There
desert.
were lots of times that he would say, there were lots of times that he would go and be by himself.
Right. So this idea of leading some type of solitary life. Now, we've talked about this idea of a cloistered life together. Again, I think most of our images of monasteries later is a later version of that, where there's a group of people that are doing that together. But early monasticism really centered around the concept of what you would probably think of as being, in fact, the term that was used is hermit. And just to understand where monasticism comes from, it comes from the Greek word monos, meaning alone or being single. And so the earliest monks were men who left their homes, their places where they live, to be alone in remote places, typically, especially given the nature of Egypt and the Middle East, a lot of desert terrain that often meant going out into the desert. And their purpose for going out into the desert, or the purpose for going out and doing this, was to have a closer have an opportunity to have a closer, better understanding of who God was. And so really this begins fairly early on in church history. In fact, sort of the first sort of monk that we know something about is someone by the name of St. Anthony. We're not going to go down a complete biographical sketch of him today, but the timing for St. Anthony roughly is about the same time of Constantine's rise and to the position in the Roman Empire, and about the same time that the Council of Nicaea is happening. In fact, one of the great biographies of St. Anthony was actually written by Athanasius, who was the one who was such the advocate at the Council of Nicaea that was fighting against the concept of Arianism. So just to put it in a timing that sort of matches what we've already covered here, one of the earliest sort of best examples of the sort of the hermit version of monasticism is St. Anthony, and that's around the late 200s, early 300s, so the late 3rd century, early 4th century. And in fact, this picture here that you see is of him in this particular thing here. And they intentionally went out to be separate from civilization, to be closer to God. And
Yeah, but I
they
can't
deliberately
get it.
abandoned,
I've got it
they
on
went
my.
out to be separate so that they were so that they were fully in a position where they wouldn't have the temptations.
Yeah, I've got it on there. I was trying to get it on my phone, but my phone's connected directly to me.
So any questions about that? Now that individual situation,
Can you go back and tell me what that word is?
asceticism. Aesthetic normally means that bare Spartan denial of things. Now, eventually, St. Anthony's an interesting case study. Part of the reason I didn't go through a biography of him, we would spend the whole time talking about it because it's really interesting. He's well known for some of his writings and some of the wisdom literature that he produced while he was there. But there's this whole story that he was isolated for 13 years, was tormented by, or according to his testimony, so I'll just have to take it at its face value, was tormented by Satan, was tempted, was eventually actually physically beaten by Satan and had to withdraw from this isolated existence. And then he got moving into this old abandoned Roman fort. He's an interesting character in history. One of the things that I couldn't help but think as I was reading through was, I don't know if he was actually facing these attacks from Satan. That certainly could be the case, but also could have just been the fact that he was, starved and dehydrated and maybe had a touch of mental illness and was imagining things. I don't know, but he had a pretty dramatic existence for about 30 years and was well known among Christians.
Who are you talking about?
His name is St. Anthony.
St. Anthony, okay.
Yeah, so if you're interested, I would encourage you to go back and do some study on your own there, just because it's sort of fascinating. But it led me to have a lot more questions than answers. I didn't want to end up chasing that rabbit too far today. But he's well known in the late 3rd, early 4th century. And again, Athanasius wrote a biography of him. And he's, if the things that he described actually happened to him, he was at war with Satan for about 15 years, which is a scary thing to think that could happen. But eventually these groups of so-called hermits sort of banded together into sometimes smaller groups. Sometimes they did this to have accountability to each other, but often it was to have protection because of leading the still alive.
Yeah, I can hear.
So,
am I causing an echo on yours?
No.
So the monastic movement also gained a lot of structure outside of the Roman world, up into the areas where Christianity had spread, which was into the British Isles. And for example, here's an Irish monastic oratory. This is from about the 4th century, give or take, that we see here. Eventually, though, the form of what we think of traditionally being here grows into these early communities, and it ultimately ends up with St. Benedict. So who's heard of Benedictine monks? He brought the idea of monastic life really more to the western part of Christianity, because St. Anthony was in the eastern part. He was actually in Alexandria, Egypt. And he established a monastery, I struggle with that word, in Italy, actually at Monte Cassino. And here it was a community, and they actually had a set of rules, the set of rules for the community. His sister founded a similar thing for women, a convent, so that's nuns flow out of that. And so these were communities that were devoted to a regimented life that was a combination of prayer and study and work. In fact, if I go back to the slide, I sort of skipped over. This is important. Of course, they prayed often. They took vows of chastity. They fasted. They gave up their worldly goods, so they were separate. But they did have things. It wasn't just that they were off doing nothing. In fact, they were off intentionally doing some other things. And so the rule of St. Benedict was that you contributed to the community through peace, prayer, and work. And so work may have taken it took a number of different forms. It could have been agriculture. In some cases, the work, most of what we have in terms of the preservation of texts were the result of monasteries doing the copying of documents. That's a very common thing. I think that's an image that we have because that was a form of work that was part of the monastic life.
Well,
Hey,
there-
Don, I have a question.
Yeah.
On one of the slides before, it said that they did this to get away from temptations like of the world, but also the marauding German what?
In the case of this Irish,
Oh, that was the Irish. Okay.
well, but it was also true in other parts of the world. The reason they banded together in these old abandoned forts was to have some to be
Protection.
separate from the world, but also have some protection from the dangers that were in the world.
Okay.
And in fact, eventually, it's not until about the 10th century that we get something called, well, there's two things. There's what's called formerly the peace of God and the truce of God. And the peace of God was actually an effort as, this is post-Charlemagne, as the Carolinian Empire is collapsing in on itself and things are becoming much more feudal and divided. There was a lot of war going on and conflict going on between various feudal lords. And in the middle of that, clergy would get caught up in these things that were going back and forth. And so the peace of God was the church actually stating officially the position is, they are the church is neutral in these conflicts. Leave the monks and leave the priests and leave the churches alone as you're going back and forth. And so part of it was that they sometimes need to be protected from barbarians, those that weren't Christian, but sometimes they need to be actually protected from various lords and leaders and military personnel, even the knights. We'll talk about that as we get into the Crusades. One of the reasons for calling the Crusades was to give these warriors called knights something to do that wasn't just beat up on each other. That's actually considered to be a motivation for what went on for the Crusades. So monks did play an important role, particularly if you look at how the church was spread into the area we think of as being Great Britain, the British Isles today. St. Patrick, for example. We didn't cover him as a biographical sketch, but St. Patrick was a monk. And so bringing the gospel to Ireland was the result of a monk who went and established monasteries and preached actually in Ireland. And so they were among the first missionaries. So if you think monks being just in a cloistered, we're going to separate ourselves from society, expressions of piety, the things that you may think of that go on in a monastery, that's one view and a correct view of monastic life, but it's not the only view of monastic life. They do become very important in early missionary efforts. Cyril and Methodius in the east, St. Patrick I already mentioned in the west. The church, the Eastern church growing out of Byzantium is expanded into the Slavic territories and makes it as far as Russia as a result of Cyril and Methodius, who were monks. And so a lot of the early missionary work were undertaken by monks. The picture here obviously is of who? That's St. Patrick. What is he doing? He's driving the snakes out of Ireland. So we know this is St. Patrick because of the snakes. So the rule of St. Benedict again was this idea of peace, prayer, and work. So they would pray anywhere from 6 to 8 hours a day with a regimented schedule, depending on which monastery you're in and which version of the Benedictine rule they followed. You may have had anywhere from 7 to a dozen designated times of prayer a day, including getting up between 2 and 4 in the morning and saying your last prayers just before midnight. And this was every day. This was a regimented process. So it was a very ordered, structured life. It was led by an abbot that comes from Abba, father, who was the leader of the monastery. The monks were considered brothers. And again, each day was divided into a regimented schedule of group prayer, private prayer, sleep, reading and study, and then also manual labor. So every day at the monastery was pretty much like every other day at the monastery unless it was Sunday, and then Sunday looked a lot like every other day at the monastery. They took vows of poverty, they took vows of obedience, and vows of chastity. And again, we talked about copying books, some of the other things that were considered work, but they also were some of the first schools, the first education things that were not just Christian education, but other universities rose out of the monastic movement. And eventually there were monasteries everywhere. The two primary branches, the Cluniac and the Cistercian monasteries. I don't know what the date is on this map, because I apparently cut that off. And as you can see, where all the dots are, there were monasteries scattered all over Europe, all over the British Isles, all over into Asia. And some of the architecture that we enjoy today, the monastic orders were big parts of that, the Cluniacs and the Cistercians. They gathered in wealth and turned that back into building many of the great cathedrals that we know. That's Canterbury there at the top, Gloucester here. There you see some of the, a church there for the Cluniacs. They did have a dispute between the two of them, the Cluniacs and the Cistercians. The Cluniacs built those beautiful abbeys and stained glass churches. The Gothic architecture that we're most familiar with comes out of that branch of monastic life. That was considered too ornate and too over the top. And so the Cluniacs responded by building very large abbeys, but as you can see, they were very sparse in how they were adorned.
So is the term abbey just what they termed kind of where they gathered?
Correct. The abbey was led by the abbot, who was the father or leader of that group. And so very often the monastery itself was described as so-and-so, so-and-so abbey. And again, there were all types of various subgroups, Augustinians, Benedictines, Dominicans, Franciscans, but they all generally followed the broad rule that was set out by Saint Benedict. And again, what I'm looking to do here is a real high overview of monasticism, because we could have spent a lot more time talking about it, but I mainly wanted to introduce it because we'll come back to it. Do we as Protestants today have monasteries?
Not that I know of.
Huh?
Trick question.
Kathy thinks it's a trick question.
No, I say no, like Donna did. I don't know of any Protestant, but I mean, are there still Catholic?
So there are still monasteries. We have
Yeah,
some, we have
I
some
know
here in
there's
Houston.
still convents. There's a monastery here in Houston.
There's one on the west side, off of Memorial. Beautiful grounds, by the way. Probably sitting on $30 to $50 million of land value, given where it's at there, like towards the villages off of Memorial.
Our priests and our nuns that at our school come from those monasteries.
So when you ask the question though, do we as Protestants still have them?
As a rule of thumb, no. There are some monastic orders that are attached to some of the, if you will, more Catholic-leaning Protestant orders, for lack of high church type things. But as a rule of thumb, no. And we're going to see why that is when we get to the Reformation, because there was a division over what the monasteries had come to be by the time of the Reformation, and whether they were still living up to, quite frankly, the things that were the vows that they had made. Remember what the vows, let me get back to the right screen here. Remember, they were vows of what? They were vows of
Not owning anything, being
Celibate.
chaste, being
here it is: poverty, obedience, chastity. It can be argued that especially during some of the times of some of the lean times that exist in the late Middle Ages, the folks that were living in monasteries were eating pretty good. They owned wealth and other things as well.
Hey, Don, one of the things y'all probably knew it, but one of the things I learned teaching at the Catholic school that I teach at is there's a difference between a sister and a nun. And I
And
had
what is
no
that
idea.
difference?
Nuns stay at the convent. They do not leave. The sisters go out into the community and teach and do whatever their vocation is. So the teachers at our schools are technically not nuns, they're sisters.
Okay. I didn't know that either.
I didn't
I
either.
didn't. I guess I didn't pick up on that distinction in the ways that I've studied because I don't encounter it every day either.
That's what one of the sisters explained to me, because I was,
Do they still call the nun sister when they address them though?
I'm assuming so, since apparently I've never met one, since I've never been out of the convent. I've only met the ones that leave, but I didn't ask that question.
Yeah.
So Sherry, do you know if the sisters have to go through like some type of formal program to be allowed to be outside of the convent?
I'm sure they do, because I think they all go through the same process with the vows and everything. It's just what their calling is, and they're kind of told what their calling is, I think. I know like the sisters, one of the sisters that ended up being a teacher, she started out in the medical field and never wanted to be a teacher, but her mother superior told her she needed to be a teacher, and so she became a teacher.
And so why would you do that?
I don't know if they're told.
Yeah, that goes back to your vow of obedience, right?
Yeah, it is. They have no say on where they go and what they teach or what they do.
Yeah. So here's the question. This is how it ties back to application. What's good about monastic life? Why would that be a good thing?
Community.
Community?
Keeps your focus on what's important.
Accountability.
Okay. And let's, I think the book is entitled, I've never read it, but I know what its title is, and I think I know what its premise is, but where it referenced is, there's a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And the argument there is the work that were done in Irish monasteries to preserve manuscripts and documents, for example, preserved so many things that if you didn't have the role of monastery doing the work, doing that thing would never happen. So just sometimes it's even practical things. I think the other things you guys mentioned are correct. What's the problem with monastic life from a scriptural point of view?
Well, we're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world.
Right.
So,
And so
we're not supposed to just live isolated.
Spreading the word.
Spreading the word, exactly. As I mentioned, the there was, again, there were some monks that went out, very much like the distinction that Sherry reminded us of, the difference between the nuns and the sisters. There were monks that went out, Patrick, Cyril, some of these others that were great missionaries. So they were carrying out the Great Commission. But there were a lot of folks, particularly in the Middle Ages, that were living in monasteries, that were living in these closed, in fact, the word cloistered means what? Isolated. We use that term to describe isolation. In these closed, cloistered communities, where are you living out the Great Commission in a dynamic way?
Yeah.
No. So one of the things that will eventually happen is there'll come a question about what is the appropriate role for clergy and what is the appropriate role for those. And Donna hit it on the head. You said it's better than, we use this for being in the world but not of the world, right? Interacting with the world. And one of the arguments that was made primarily by by the reformers and Protestants in the Reformation against monastic life was it's not scriptural in that sense. You need to be engaged in the world around you. And even though we have Old Testament examples of the prophets, God calling them off for periods of time to be alone. We have the example of John the Baptist. We have Christ in his temptation. we also continuously throughout Scripture have believers that are being called to engage.
Hey, Don, the other thing, so were these typically unmarried men?
Most of them had never been married, and so they didn't, obviously, if they'd been married, they weren't allowed to leave their spouse to go and join this. So yes,
Okay.
these were single men. And the scripture that they would tie that to is Paul writing about, if you, it would be better if you weren't, but if you can't,
Right.
then do this. So they had, again, it's easy to forget there are scriptural things that can be pointed to for each and everything here.
Right.
And again, I don't want to leave the impression, again, a number of things that we enjoy today came out of monasteries. But ultimately what came to be the thing, and we'll come back around to this again, as I've said, we're talking about the Reformation, is this question of what is the proper role of a believer in his devotion to God? And does that mean, cloistering yourself away for 30 years? Yeah, you're praying 12 hours a day, but you're not interacting with any non-believers when you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a selfish thing, just me and God.
Right.
I don't care about anybody else that needs God. I just care about me having God.
Yeah. And again, the New Testament example of the church, we have a word for it, koinonia, right? It's a community. And so the argument is made, well, the monastery, that's a community, right? Which is true. It is a community, but it's not the same thing of being as a community in the broader community or in the broader context.
Well,
Hey, Don, it's Albert.
Yeah, go ahead, Albert.
So as far as like helping the community and helping like the world, didn't they create beer so that they'd have water to drink?
Yep.
And
champagne comes out of the monastery.
Yeah, I've heard of several.
And then like Chimay in Belgium, there are these Belgian monks that are there, and they've been doing it for like hundreds of years.
There's certain monasteries that are known for their wines and
Yeah.
their.
For example, one of the slides there referenced how some of them became prominent in the wool trade, for example.
Yeah.
And again, if it hadn't been for the works inside of monasteries, producing, for example, manuscripts, I know I keep coming back to that, but thinking about that, it goes back to that image I have, but there was no IBM copier, right? Or no Xerox machine. And so, it's actually a Xerox commercial, not an IBM commercial now to think about it. There was no Xerox machine, so somebody needed to be doing that work. So that was valuable work that was benefiting mankind as a whole, was benefiting the church as a whole. But again, the question that ultimately came to be during the Reformation is, what is the proper role of Christians in society? And that's what we're going to come back to. So I wanted to just insert this because to not talk about this and its evolution would be missing something. But I'm mainly, again, it's setting up what's going to happen that we're going to talk about down the road. So any more questions?
Weren't there monasteries though that like took the vow of silence or something? For some reason, I definitely remember hearing about silence. So yes, you can pray, but if you're in a group of people who have vowed to not speak to each other, what kind of a community is that?
Hey, Kathy. Yesterday, yesterday I watched a video. It's on Netflix. It's called Chef's Table. And it's really fantastic, the way they shot it. And they've talked about Texas barbecue. They've talked about all this different cuisine. Well, they were doing a series on temple food. And so they had this monk from Korea, a Buddhist monk from Korea that came to New York to show their cuisine. And they went back with her and they spent like maybe a month shooting her. And so you can kind of see the getting up at 2 a.m. for prayer, getting up at 6 a.m. for prayer, going to sleep at midnight. And her job was to tend the garden. And so she has like this, garden that's better than organic because it's, no pesticides, whatever the ground takes, whatever But anyways, I think if you spend 30 minutes watching that, you would probably see a modern, actually like a current Buddhist temple, how it functions, because it sounds like it functions quite the same.
There's a lot
But
of similarities. Between Christian
she went there
monasteries
at
and
about
Buddhist.
17 years of age, and now she's probably in her late 60s.
What was the name,
And
Albert?
so it's Chef's Table is the name of the actual series. And you just scroll through, you'll see her. It looks like a man, because it looks like a Buddhist monk with his head shaved, but it's a woman. I'll try to find the. I'll try to, I guess, text in the series number. But it's fantastic.
Thank you.
All right. Any more questions or comments about that? All right. Back to politics, back to history. Now we're going to pick back up with what is referred to generally as the investiture controversy. So this picks up from 1076. So anybody know what investiture means or stands for?
Commit to.
Commit to, okay, to be invested in, okay. Sort of comes from that. Throughout history, particularly various religious offices, but true of political offices, they very often have vestments or clothing that they wear that's symbolic of their position. So for example, just think about it in the modern Catholic context now, what does the Pope wear at various points?
Ornate robing.
There's ornate robing that's a particular color, and then there's either the small little, skull cap type of covering, or there's the full-blown, what's called a mitre. That's the papal mitre. The cardinals wear those, for example. So those all represent their office or their position. So one of the ways that you knew somebody was a bishop, especially inside of the church when it was still inside the Catholic Church at this point, was by the vestments that they wore. And so when you were moved into that position, there was a ceremony known as your investiture, which means that you got the garments. You were given the garments that indicated that you had the office. And so the controversy that arises in the 11th century is over. It's referred to the investiture controversy because it's over who has the right to determine that you ought to be given the garments. They weren't fighting over the garments themselves. What they were fighting over was who had the right to give the garments. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So who do you think the two parties are in this that are fighting over who ought to give the garments? Anybody want to take a guess at why there's a controversy? Who's going to be in controversy with each other?
The state and the church.
Two churches.
The state and the church. And it's helpful to think back to some of the history that we did cover. What was the relationship in the late 8th century, so the 700s into the early 9th century, around 800, between the church and, for example, we'll talk about the Frankish state? What was the relationship between Charlemagne and the Pope, for example?
Well, the Pope made Charlemagne the first Holy Roman Emperor.
Correct. So the Pope gave Charlemagne his position, and what did Charlemagne do for the papacy? He helped support them, right? So there was this close relationship that existed between church and state. Generally speaking, what do kings want?
Power.
Power.
Yeah. And so what ultimately happens is if there's a conflict between political power, authority, and religious or clerical power, you can imagine where eventually you get the right personalities clashing here and what is going to happen.
Conflict, controversy.
Yeah. So here, boom, you 1076, and you have the investiture controversy. So what had been the case was there'd been sort of this relationship that existed between the church and secular rulers, such that as political authority grew centralized, remember that's a lot of the theme of the Middle Ages, Charlemagne coming to power, is taking all these various tribal groups and bringing them into the concept of what we think of as the modern nation state. So the authority is not just a local lord, but it's something that goes higher to the level of a king or an emperor. So things are going more centralized. But what starts happening is there's the question of who gets to appoint the local authority, the local church authority. And it had been the case through a lot of the period up until the middle of the 11th century, where the local political authority had a great deal of control over who was given the church appointments in that location. And so the investiture literally is to give the church the clothing, the insignia of the office. But remember that the church controlled a lot of land, they controlled a lot of territory, and they controlled, because of offerings, they controlled a fair amount of wealth. And so what eventually happens is, as the religious authority, particularly as the papacy, is becoming more authoritarian as we move through this period of time, the schism in 1054 being an expression of that, the ability of the Pope to say, you're no longer part of the church, for example, eventually we get into a situation where there's a struggle. And normally the church had the ultimate trump card here. They have the power to
Excommunicate.
And if you were excommunicated, we talked a little bit about this either last week or the week before. What did it mean to be excommunicated?
You couldn't get to heaven.
First of all, you couldn't enjoy the graces of the church, and that was important. But also, as indicated on the slide here, you couldn't conduct business. You were separate from the excommunication, ex from the community, is what that meant. And so you were, the ultimate trump card was held by the church. If you're excommunicated, you are out. And in the structure of what was there, that was a problem. And so we had a number of different political authorities. Henry IV, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip IV of France, Henry and his son, King John of England, all fought with the church over who had the right to appoint local officials. In other words, who had the power of investiture. And for a long period of time, it was almost as if the church gave a rubber stamp on whatever the local, or sometimes broader, in this case, the national political authority, if you're Henry II or John. But there comes a point here where they get into a real struggle over who's going to have the right to appoint. And this really came to a head under Pope Gregory VII, when he dictated in his Dictatus Papae, and he then said that basically the Pope alone is universal. That sort of flowing out of 1054 and the schism. He alone has the power to depose and reinstate bishops. He alone can use the imperial insignia. Princes have to kiss the foot of the Pope, meaning that they owe their allegiance, they owe their position to the Pope, and that he has the power to depose emperors, and he can be judged by no one. This is papal power expressed to the max under Gregory. And so it made the Pope over secular authorities. So remember, how do most kings at this time, what do they claim their authority comes from?
God.
The divine right of kings, right? That God has appointed them as rulers. That also ties back to some of the scriptural things that Paul writes about, respecting authorities. So at this point, primarily under Gregory, and again, the various secular powers that exist, this now comes to a head over who has the ultimate control. And Gregory comes forth and says, let me make this very clear. I'm issuing this declaration. The Pope is over all things temporal as well as all things spiritual, ultimately. Questions
What kind of
about that?
power did he have? What kind of power did he have? I mean, I understand he's got the bishops, the priests, and the masses on their knees, but he had to have some other power, did he not? I mean, I don't think he had a standing army. I don't think he had the Swiss Guard. But what are the powers gave him that right?
Ultimately, his power, using the term of power versus authority, his power was in the ability to excommunicate.
Okay.
You know, a king that stands up to the Pope that says, I don't think you have that authority. First of all, the Pope has said he alone has the right to depose you. We're going to carry on with that here in a minute. But
Right.
in addition to that, you're no longer part of the church. You're excommunicated, which was a pretty powerful, like I said, it's a pretty powerful trump card to be able to play.
Gotcha.
So this clash, this investiture thing comes to a head in the 11th century. And so again, Gregory's view is that no one can be regarded as Catholic who doesn't agree with the church. Catholic meaning the universal church. If you're not part of the universal church, you're not part of the universal church. And that he alone, in his role as Pope, this inherited authority that had come down through Peter, from Christ through Peter, was that he actually had the power to absolve subjects of their oath of fealty. In other words, if you were a subject in a temporal kingdom, a secular kingdom, you had sworn your allegiance to your local lord, who had sworn his allegiance to a king. Gregory says, I have the power to say that that oath which you made before God, if that ruler is wicked, or for example, if that ruler has been excommunicated, so they're no longer in fellowship with the church, I can absolve you of your oath. Everybody follow that?
Yes.
So he can tell the followers of any king, I know you gave an oath to that king, but I've decided that king is wicked. Therefore, you are no longer bound by that oath, even though you made that oath to God, because I'm the Pope, I can absolve you of that. So if you're one of the kings or leaders of a nation state at this time, probably how do you feel about that?
Not very good.
Not very good at all. And so what ends up happening is they begin to push back, and this ends up being a conflict between the church and secular authorities. But think about being the average person. What's it like when your king and your pope, both of whom you hold in a position of esteem, are fighting with each other? What kind of place does it put you in?
Confusion.
Pretty bad place, right?
Bad
Yeah.
one.
And so
Wait,
they
let
do-
me ask one question, Don. So where did Gregory get, I mean, was this just something, his own ideology, or did he claim that, God gave him this power to do all this, or do we know?
Well, it is his own ideology, but then it actually goes back in the most fundamental way to the thing that we've looked at so many times. And again, this idea of apostolic succession. And remember, you've seen the papacy grow, and we've seen it grow in authority as we've looked at this history over the last couple of years, is that the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. Who was the first Bishop of Rome from their perspective?
Peter.
What authority had Peter been given in their minds?
All authority.
All authority. Whatever will be bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you release on earth will be released in heaven. Through apostolic succession, Peter, and the position of Peter was given that authority. So Gregory is just carrying that to its ultimate, at least in his mind, way that it plays out in his way of thinking. And so he believes he's just stating something that already exists and needs stating. So ultimately, they end up having this thing called the Concordat of Worms in 1122. This is now a subsequent pope. This is not Gregory. This is a subsequent pope and Henry V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, and they come to essentially a settlement. And the settlement is that the king does not have the right to invest who the Pope is, who an archbishop is, who a bishop is, but those bishops, archbishops, owe their fealty to the secular monarchs in exchange for military protection. So here's the trade-off. King X, you don't get to say who's bishop. That's solely the Pope's and the church's right to say so. But the bishops that are appointed owe responsibility back to you because you are protecting them. Sort of, you see the compromise they've come to here? The king gives up his authority to appoint, but he gets loyalty, and the loyalty comes from the fact that he's providing protection.
So this all happened over who could give the people in the church, though, these clothing.
The reason it's called the investiture thing is because of the clothing, but understanding who gets the clothes is who you've picked to say who's going to be in that position. So, for example, if you're King John of England and you want a certain person to be because they are loyal to you or they're connected to a family that's loyal to you, remember you also have the inheritance laws. Where did a lot of the high-ranking clergy come from?
Upper class.
Upper class, and they were typically the second, third, fourth sons of nobility. And the reason was who inherited?
The first.
Son, the oldest son.
The oldest.
Right, the first.
And so you're the second son. You can't be Lord X of Y, but yet you come from. So it was very common for the non-eldest sons, for example, to go in and become priests and bishops and leaders. This was a very common thing that happened.
So it wasn't necessarily who was the most devout or trained or like came up with new things based off of what they read in scripture or anything. So there was, I mean, I know there's hierarchy in the church, but because I was kind of like, why would the state feel like they had the right to tell the church who gets promoted in the church? But it's because there's
a tight connection between the church and the state. The king derives his position from.
But I kind of thought that the church had kind of taken over. I thought in the void of the ruling, the church had kind of become important. And I guess I kind of just forgot that there was still government and they clashed with the church. I kind of thought the church had.
Well, they hadn't clashed as much up until this point. Because again, going back to the best expression of this is what we talked about Christmas Day 800. Charlemagne is worshiping in the St. Peter's in Rome, and the Pope comes over and says, crowning you the Holy Roman Emperor. That was sort of the ultimate expression of church and state being bound together. And that continued on for a couple of centuries until after the schism and again, the other thing that's going on, the rise here are more and more of centralized political authority. Charlemagne's a good example of that. Clovis before that, but then coming down to Charlemagne, united these various Germanic tribes into a single empire, into a single state. This was happening everywhere. Same as going on in that's France, or the area we think of as being France. Same thing is going on to some degree in Germany. It's going on in England. It's going on all over the place, that the political authorities are growing more centralized and thus are growing stronger. And so now there's this clash between the church and state. And the way it plays itself out is just initially is who gets to appoint these local offices. And the process hadn't been up until the controversy arose. that often the king or the local lord was given that authority. The church did not look at it as being a big deal until it reached the point that there was disagreement, and then it became a big deal. So they come to this settlement in 1122 that sort of balances it out. The church has the right to invest and appoint, but those local authorities owe an allegiance to the king or the monarch in exchange for the military protection.
So was this Pope
Go ahead.
Calixtus, was he after Gregory?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Gregory is through 1085.
Okay.
And this actually, they eventually come to this settlement in 1122.
Was there a certain party or element in one of the nations that kind of was the crux of this fight? Would Henry want to appoint someone, say, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, that the Pope didn't want, or do we even know that?
Yeah, there are a number of examples of that. The biggest expressions of it that I remember from just my knowledge of history and then studying it were primarily French and English. And in terms of being where most of the clashes took place. Eventually, the Holy Roman Emperor, though, becomes more of a Germanic thing after Charlemagne, when the second appointment happens in the middle 10th century. And so there was still some of that going on with the territories that we think of as being modern Germany, the principalities that were there. But again, the examples that are here that came to a head were French and English, and that was a pretty common thing. And of course, France and England are about to be entering into the 100 Years' War, where they're at conflict for 3 to 4 generations over who has superiority on the continent, who has the claim to what. So by the time we get to Innocent III, here's sort of a good summary. The Lord Jesus Christ has set up one ruler over all the earth, all things as his universal vicar, and as all things in heaven and earth and hell bow to the knee of Christ, so should all obey Christ's vicar. There will be one flock and one shepherd. Who is he referring to as the vicar there? Himself.
The
It's
Pope.
the office of the Pope. And the way that it's described here, I think, is well done on the slide. The Pope considered himself lower than God, but higher than any other man, and that included kings and nobility.
Did it include higher than Christ?
No.
No. Okay. I was like,
But remember remember that their view of the position of the Pope really is bound in the scripture that we've used here as our launching point of Peter was given the keys. And so the argument was he wasn't just given the keys to the church, he was given the keys to the world.
So who is Innocent III?
He was a pope in the early
Okay.
13th.
Another Pope.
Yeah, another pope in the late 12th, early 13th century. And eventually he ends up launching a crusade. We're going to talk about the Crusades here in a little bit against some reformers that were in France that were considered heretics, that were protected by the French crown. So this is sort of where this got into a little bit of some controversy as well. So the other thing to realize is part of the reason that there was conflict between the papacy and secular monarchs was not just over authority and power, but it was also over, guess what? Money. There's a famous U.S. court case that went to the Supreme Court, said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And so in many cases, what these kings wanted or needed to do for their own benefit was they wanted to tax the riches that were contained within the churches that were there. And so, for example, when France and Britain began the 100 Years' War, wars require what? They require money. And so they wanted to be able to tax fully, and that included taxing what was going on in the local churches and convents and monasteries, the other things that were there. So you get into this conflict that's over who has the right to appoint. That's the investiture conflict. But you also get into this conflict over whose money is that's sitting in the church's coffers. Can the king tax the church? And so by the time we come down here to the 100 Years' War, Boniface VIII comes along and says, by issuing a papal bull, which is a papal decree, that you can't tax the church without whose approval?
Pope.
The Pope. Just like you can't appoint that person without whose approval?
Pope.
The Pope. So you see this situation where there's this now over position, but also over money, where there's what's going on. Now, the consequence was, you see here, that the way that things went back is that some of these kings, the English king denied clergy access to his royal court. Philip IV forbade the export of money to Italy from France. So it's like, okay, I can't tax the churches in France, but what I can do is prevent the churches in France from sending money to where? Rome. I'm not going to tax them, but I'm not going to let them send the money to you. And so ultimately, you see even here that Boniface actually backs down from this thing, saying, all right, you can tax the clergy in an emergency. We'll talk about what that constituted earlier. And the reason he did that was why? You see it here on the slide that I've already used. It's because he needed the money. So I mentioned before, what was sort of the ultimate trump card that the church would play against a king?
Communication.
What was the ultimate trump card to some degree now that the kings were playing back against the church? You need money. And this is an ongoing struggle for hundreds of years. Technically, this is an ongoing struggle that we still face down to some degree to today. Go ahead, Vicky.
The reality is that if you're a liberal priest, liberal imam, or liberal Protestant, you can, like in the African American community, get up and say, we need to vote for the Democratic Party. Whereas our former mayor threatened, I think, Second Baptist, telling them that she would revoke their tax exemption if continued on with his line of thinking. And that's threatened. Not all the Protestant church and the Catholic church are conservative, but they will threaten you with hitting you with a tax.
And in fact, we have a tradition in this country of, what do we call it? We call it separation of
Church and state.
Church and state. This flows out of the long-standing conflict that has existed between church and state. Does the state have the right to tell the church what to do? Does the church have the right to tell the state what to do? This is not a new conflict that our founding fathers suddenly found themselves in the middle of, and thus put provisions in the Constitution. The First Amendment is about Congress shall make no law regarding the what?
Religion.
Establishment of religion. It's the Establishment Clause. This has its roots all the way back into to some degree into the investiture discussion about political office, in addition to religious office. So what ultimately happens is, after basically the French say you can't send any money, Boniface fires back and says, but I still have supremacy over the temporal and secular things, the things we agreed back in that Concordat of Worms. And so what we get into here, and this is where we'll pick it up next week, because we need to break now for those especially that need to get from where you are potentially to the church, is we're going to see that this conflict plays itself out in some interesting ways over the next 70-ish to 100 years, in the sense of the conflict between France and Rome. So that we end up with something known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, or the Avignon papacy, which is even where the Pope has residence, is where we're going to lead to here. And this flows out of this conflict between church and state. So that's we're going to end on a cliffhanger. Come back next week to find out what happens. Questions, comments?
Very interesting.
Yeah. And again, try to bring the history to modern day relevance. Elements of this are still going on today. We still struggle today I think with both elements of what we've talked about here, with the idea of monasticism and the role between the church and secular government, we still struggle with that. We can fall into a form of monasticism that doesn't look like a monastery, right? We're just the insular church. We just fellowship with each other because it's comfortable and easy. But the same thing we would use as a claim about what was wrong with monastery life, with not engaging that, we can fall into that same trap, even though we don't have the same trappings, if that makes any sense. And then we can get pulled into, for better or worse, sometimes for good reasons or bad reasons, we can get pulled into the relationship between what is the proper role of the church relative to the secular government, and the secular government relative to the church. This is not new. It's still going on. We're debating it in different ways, but it's still there. All right. Anything else? All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.